One of the fundamental aspects of a database is the transaction log. Now, the transaction log is something you need to, first of all, understand what it's doing. Then, second of all, understand how, as an administrator, you use the transaction log to protect your database. So first off, let's look at a couple of little animations here, and I want you to understand exactly how the transaction log is working in the SQL Server 2005 world. Let's start with a little diagram and let's do a little what if here. Let's just say that we've got a number of updates that need to be made to a database that are going to be made by a user. Well, if the user just makes those updates to the database, we now have a problem. If the updates are made in real time to the database, and so let's say the updates are written into the database, as they happen, and this is just signifying that updates have been written onto the disk. Well, think about what's happening here. Our database is in a certain order. It's in a clustered index order, which means, for example, if it's an employee table, it's in the order of the employee's last name. It means that the disk actually has to spin to locate the data in the right order on the data pages. Well, that's not very efficient. That's going to slow the database down. Okay, now there are some other things, but we'll get to those in just shortly. Let's look at how a transaction log could help that particular situation. We've got the same database, and now instead of writing directly to the database, we're going to write to a transaction log first. So an update happens that the user needs to make, and instead of pushing it into the database, they push it into the transaction log. Okay, so it goes into the log. Another one's made, it goes into the transaction log, and so on. Now, as these transactions build up in the transaction log, we have a place here to more or less pre-stage them. And so the transaction log can then organize them and then push them into the database and write them into the places that they belong as it finds other things that it needs to write in that same general area. Okay, that's an oversimplified version, a representation of what's going on with the transaction log, but that's one of the fundamental things. The big news for you is this transaction log sits here, and if you'll notice what it's done effectively, it has become more or less a VCR, or a recorder of every insert, update, and delete that has happened to this database. They were all captured here first, they were organized, then they were pushed into the database. This becomes a huge area for us on backups and restores, because I've got the database in the order it was the last time I did a backup, right here, a full backup. Now I've got incrementals or transactional changes to the database over time. Okay, so this can be huge. Now, transaction logs do a whole lot more. In the next video or two, I'm going to talk about exactly what are transactions, go a little deeper with this process and how the transaction log is working. And then in a couple of other videos, I'm going to talk about implicit and explicit transactions and some other aspects of them. But transaction logs, trust me, are huge to the administrator. They can make or break your database. So as we go on through the next few videos, I want to add to your knowledge and understanding of how you can use these things to really bring a lot of stability to your data.